In the 1960s, a Soviet radar operator watched a single dot blink onto his screen. High over Sverdlovsk, 40 seconds later, that dot, a $2 million American spy plane called the U-2, was a smoking crater in a field. Flying high had been America's whole strategy. Fly above the missiles, above the guns, above the problem. That strategy just got disproven in under a minute. Here's the thing people get wrong about that day. The U-2 wasn't shot down because it was suddenly spotted. Soviet radar had been tracking Francis Gary Powers' flight almost from the moment it crossed the border. The U-2 was never invisible. It was built on the assumption that no missile could climb high enough, fast enough to reach it at 70,000 feet. That assumption held for 4 years of overflights, but on May 1st, 1960, a salvo of SA-2 surface-to-air missiles finally closed the altitude gap. One detonated close enough to shred the tail. The plane didn't need to be hit dead on. Radar-guided missiles don't need a bullseye, they just need to get close enough for a proximity fuse to do the rest. Altitude had been a strategy, not a solution, and strategies built on "they can't reach us yet" have an expiration date. So the next idea naturally became speed. If they can't fly high enough forever, they'll just have to be insanely faster. The SR-71 became the fastest plane the United States has ever created. And it worked, genuinely and remarkably well. No SR-71 was ever shot down in over 3,000 combat missions, despite hundreds of missiles fired at it. So why did the US eventually walk away from just outrun it as the answer, instead of building more planes like it? To answer that question, there are a few reasons, and none of them are it stopped working. First, cost. The SR-71 was staggeringly expensive to operate. It leaked fuel at rest by design. The airframe panels were built with gaps that only sealed once heat expansion took over at the plane's cruising speed. And it needed specially blended fuel, specialized tankers, and a small army of ground crew for every flight hour. Second, satellites were catching up on the reconnaissance mission itself. By the late 1970s, spy satellites could photograph the same targets without risking a pilot or crossing a border at all, which quietly removed part of the SR-71's whole reason for existing. Third, and most importantly, for where the story goes, speed only solves the missile problem. It does nothing about the detection problem. A Mach 3 aircraft is still a massive, glowing return on a radar screen and screaming hot infrared target. It's just gone before anyone can act on that information, but radar and missile guidance were only getting faster too. Outrunning the response works right up until the response gets fast enough. Relying on your enemy's equipment staying slow forever is not a permanent plan. What the US Pentagon actually wanted was a plane that didn't need to be high enough or fast enough. It wanted a plane that simply couldn't be seen. To understand why that's hard, you need to understand radio frequency energy and then goes quiet and listens. If that pulse hits something solid, part of the energy bounces back towards the dish, and the receiver measures how long the echo took to return and from what angle. That's the whole idea. Same principle as shouting into a cannon and timing the echo, just with radio waves instead of sound. The strength of that echo is what radar engineers call a radar cross section, or RCS. Basically, how big does this object look to a radar wave? Which is not the same thing as how big the object actually is. RCS is measured in an equivalent flat metal sphere. A fighter jet might have an RCS of several square meters, while a well-designed stealth aircraft can be pushed down toward the RCS of a golf ball or a bee, despite being enormous in real life. Here's the accidental problem. A smooth, aerodynamically curved jet is also by pure geometry an efficient radar reflector. Curved metal surfaces behave like a curved mirror. Angle a curved surface at a radar dish from almost any direction, and some part of the curve is facing the dish nearly head on, bouncing energy straight back. The exact same shapes engineers spent decades refining to cut cleanly through air were, by coincidence, shapes that reflect radio waves back at whoever is transmitting them. After Vietnam, where Soviets applied surface-to-air missile radar locked onto American aircraft with brutal efficiency, this stopped being a curiosity and became the single most urgent problem in American military aviation. You could shrink a plane, you could paint it radar-absorbent black. Neither one actually solved the underlying physics, because nobody could calculate in advance and with precision exactly where a radar wave would scatter once it struck a real oddly shaped aircraft. Without that math, you're just guessing and hoping. In 1962, a Soviet physicist named Pyotr Ufimtsev published a dense, unglamorous paper on something called the physical theory of diffraction. Equations describing how electromagnetic waves scatter specifically off the edges and discontinuities of a shape, not just the smooth bounce off a curved surface that older radar theory focused on. Inside the Soviet Union, this was treated as pure theoretical physics with no obvious weapons application. Dry enough, in fact, that it got cleared for open academic publication. The Soviets handed this math to the entire world for free, effectively assuming no one could turn abstract diffraction equations into an actual airplane. However, in 1975, 13 years after Ufimtsev's publication, a Lockheed mathematician named Bill Schroeder and an engineer named Dennis Oberholzer were combing through old technical literature for anything that might help with the radar problem, and found Ufimtsev's paper sitting translated in a library reference file. What they realized was this: if you modeled an aircraft not as one smooth curved surface, but as a collection of flat, individually angled panels, Ufimtsev's equations became something you could actually compute by hand. This was years before the computing power existed to model radar scattering off complex curves. Flat panels turned an unsolvable continuous physics problem into a finite calculable one. For each individual facet, you could work out exactly which direction it would deflect an incoming radar pulse. That was the entire trick. Curved surfaces scatter radar unpredictably in every direction, guaranteeing some energy bounces straight back regardless of your position. Flat, precisely angled panels are pure controllable geometry. Tilt every single surface of the aircraft so that no facet ever points back at a radar dish sitting on the ground or in the air, and the pulse deflects off into empty sky where nothing is listening for it. With the new information, Lockheed Skunk Works, the same secretive division that had built the SR-71, built a small demonstrator entirely out of these flat angled facets. It looked less like an aircraft and more like a crumpled piece of foil art. Test engineers nicknamed it the Hopeless Diamond because on paper it looked far too aerodynamically unstable to fly at all. It flew, barely. The faceted shape sacrificed almost all natural aerodynamic stability. The resulting aircraft, half blue, needed an onboard fly-by-wire computer making tiny correction inputs hundreds of times per second just to stay level. Without that constant computer assist, it would have tumbled out of the sky within seconds of losing control authority. Both half-blue prototypes eventually crashed during flight testing. The pilot survived. The program did not get cancelled because the radar results were undeniable. An aircraft the size of a small fighter jet was returning a radar echo smaller than a bird. To a radar operator watching the screen, it might as well not have existed. Blue became the F-117 Nighthawk, and the entire program stayed classified. The public didn't even know the aircraft existed until 1988. Its real test came in 1991, during the Gulf War, when F-117s flew directly over Baghdad, at the time one of the most heavily defended cities on Earth. Thick with surface-to-air missile batteries and radar coverage, the jets flew in, hit their targets, and came home. Iraqi radar operators never got a workable lock the entire war. Stealth had gone from a theoretical diffractions paper nobody in the Soviet Union thought was worth classifying to the reason pilots could fly through the most dangerous airspace on the planet without ever appearing on a screen. Here's the part that still doesn't quite sit right. By the 1990s, computers had finally gotten powerful enough to calculate radar scattering off curved surfaces too, not just flat facets, which is exactly why later stealth aircraft like the B-2 Spirit and the F-22 Raptor look smooth and blended again, instead of faceted like the F-117. The angular, jagged look was never the actual goal. It was a workaround for the limits of the computing available during the time. Once engineers could model continuously curved shapes with the same precision Ufimtsev's math gave them for flat panels, they could get low RCS and good aerodynamics in the same airframe, instead of choosing one or the other. The underlying idea, control exactly where radar energy goes, rather than hoping it doesn't come back, never changed at all. Only the shapes capable of executing that idea did. Modern stealth aircraft like the F-35 and B-2 pair their low RCS shaping with radar-absorbent material coatings, composite skins embedded with materials that convert incoming radar energy into small amounts of heat instead of reflecting it, adding another layer of reduction on top of pure geometry. Engine inlets are varied and serpentine-shaped specifically to hide the fan blades, one of the single largest radar reflectors on any jet. Infrared signatures gets engineered down too, mixing exhaust with cooler bypass air before it ever leaves the airframe. Because by the time stealth aircraft stopped showing up on radar, adversaries simply started hunting for their heat instead. The newest airframe built on this lineage, the B-21 Radar, pushes toward an even more aerodynamically efficient flying wing shape than the B-2 before it. Fewer seams, fewer edges, fewer places for a radar wave to catch a discontinuity and scatter back, all while modern manufacturing finally allows that shape to also be more fuel efficient and structurally lighter than the compromises Cold War engineers had to accept. Sixth generation fighter programs going even further, exploring adaptive, smart skins that can adjust their electromagnetic properties in real time depending on the radar frequency threatening them, rather than being tuned for one static threat profile the way the F-117 was. None of that erases where it started, though. Every one of those aircraft still running the same core insight a Soviet physicist wrote down almost by accident in 1962 and an American engineer happened to rediscover on the right afternoon, in the right library looking for a solution everyone else had already decided was impossible.